Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Friends of the Dar, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Tonight we welcome back Alison Shan Price, who will be delivering another installment in her yearly series on ladies who traveled the Arabian Peninsula during the last several centuries. The subject of tonight's lecture is Lady Anne Blunt. Lady Anne stands out in particular among these ladies, as her activities were not particularly to gather information for the British Empire, camouflaging them under the archaeological and cultural investigations. Rather, she did serious, accurate research into the center of her life, the Arabian horse. Like her mother, who was the only legitimate daughter of the infamous Lord Byron, and whose work preceded the development of modern computer, she conducted her research studiously, keeping careful records, diagrams, and drawings. Her husband had much in common with Lord Byron, except that he was not an excellent poet. Today, she is accredited not only with her outstanding research and the scientific breeding of the Arabian horse, but also for breeding of a foundation stock of Arabian horses that led to the development of the thoroughbred breed, whose lineage is based upon these excellent Arabians. Lady Anne Blunt founded the Crabbet Park Stud Farm in England. This is of special interest to us in Kuwait. Many of the Arabian horses she bought were shipped there to be bred. The farm was later bought by a Kuwaiti, Muhammad al-Mutawwa. Two of his daughters, Nadia and Jamila, along with Sheikha Bari'a Salim Sabah Salim Sabah, went on to win the gold, silver, and bronze medals in show jumping in the 1982 Asian Games. This marked the beginning of competitive equestrian sport in Kuwait, which continues to this day. Tonight, Alison will be delivering a lecture entitled A Pilgramage to Nejd, Lady Anne Blunt, 1823-1917. At the risk of being blunt, I must remind you that it is rude to play with your telephone during this lecture. So be kind and turn it off, and let's welcome Alison Shan Price.
Thank you. Thank you, Sheikh Hussa and the Dar al-Athar al-Islamiyyah for this unparalleled opportunity to present my sixth lecture in the series, The Middle East and Victoria's Women. This ongoing research focuses on the records of such women who traveled, worked, lived, and often died within this region of the Near and the Middle East in the 19th and the early 20th century. May I take the opportunity to thank you, because you are giving me so much research. It is such an opportunity to take your research and discuss it in London. So I feel a little bit like a conduit, taking the information that I gather from London, from the ladies' journals, and actually sharing your information with others. Here are some of the ladies that I have studied: Gertrude Bell, Dame Violet Dixon, Dame Freya Stark, and Doreen Ingrams. And they're in my previous lectures. All these ladies are very different. And I know that Badr and I have a lot of discussions about this. But each lady has something incredibly important to tell. The most important thing they did was they gave of their time and all their skills to the people of the country. What I have found is changing. As I investigate, I get more information. I found that they were dangers to the British. Letters, secret letters, in various archives, Churchill being one, states that they must be watched. Gertrude Bell, for one, was called a pan-Arabist, a danger to the British idea of any progression that they wanted to make. Dame Violet Dixon of Q8, she helped people in the time of floods and also in the time of great famine. She has been known as Kuwait and also Saud. And she was given the house by Sheikh Abdullah, now called the Dixon House Cultural Centre. How wonderful to actually have a house named by a country after your name because of her selfless deeds. Freya Stark, I have since found, went to America and she fought for the right of the Palestinian people in the time of World War II. Irrelevant of a change of idea, whatever Britain had to say about it, she continued. And the Senate wanted her banned. And Doreen Ingrams, who we learnt about last year, and I have been supported by the Sultana Rashid, the wife of Sultan Ghalib II al-Qadi. She, in the times of famine, built hospitals, rolled up her sleeves, and saved so many lives. Again, she was sent away from the Middle East after the Second World War for certain reasons. But she continued to write, she continued to fight, she continued to make programs at the BBC about Arab ladies and about certain situations. She also gave money to help Palestinian girls go into university. So there's a lot that we're learning about such ladies. They're very interesting because they were determined to do what they wanted to do. These ladies' writings and their photographs hold details of Arabian Paleolithic and Neolithic cultures, the remnants of ancient imperial civilizations, petroglyphs carved into rocks, and the locations of long-gone camel caravan routes, passing through what Gertrude Bell called the birthplace of civilization and Abrahamic religions. Words that weave amongst their chapters ongoing socio- and geopolitical changes within the 400-year-old and after the Ottoman Empire, the hegemon and tax collector of Arabia. They hold recollections of peoples, experiences of tribal warfare, world war, and the concern of forthcoming battles between modernization, which we now call globalization, and the cultural preservation of the personal identity. In its entirety, this collective of authorship and photographic evidence, which today is preserved in disparate international archives, constitutes a detailed historical record of the region between 1850 and 1950, and it still has to be investigated. And thank you for your information about certain pictures that have come to light that you are going to share with us, share with me later. Thank you. Such is the information that it is so valuable that in 2017, the Newcastle University Archives of Gertrude Bell were accepted into the UNESCO Memory Register for Prosperity. It can be hard to imagine, in our world of convenience, what their lives were like. The natural environment of the Middle East is and was harsh and unpredictable. They write in passing reference of turbulent sandstorms and floods destroying towns, hurricanes on the Euphrates rivers that capsize steamboats, the scorching and freezing temperatures, the destroyed European battalions in World War I because of these temperatures, brackish water, sand fever, typhoid, cholera, and the mysterious button that visitors were warned about. And yet, it was Arabia, thousands of miles from their birthplace, that they fell in love with, and they made it their home. As Lady Anne Blunt wrote in 1878, "It is strange how the gloomy thoughts would vanish as one sets foot in Asia. Only yesterday we were still tossing on the sea of European thought, with its political anxieties and its restless aspirations. The heritage of the unquiet race of Japhet. And now we seem to have ridden into the still water where we can rest and forget and be peaceful." So was travel safe? Yes, if under the protection of the Ottoman Pasha or the regional sheikh, who sent accompanying soldiers and loyal tribesmen to be their guides. If not, robbery and murder awaited the unfortunate in desert scenes reminiscent of Victorian London and British highway robbery. Disguise was advised. In the mid-1800s, William Palgrave, author of A Narrative of the Year's Journey Through Central and Eastern Arabia, convinced locals that he was a Syrian doctor to reach and work as a doctor in Riyadh. That he was a spy for Napoleon III quadrupled his danger. Rosetta Forbes, author of Red Sea to Blue Nile, traveled veiled, and yet to escape a sword-wielding crowd shouting death to all Christians, had to eat soap to convince them she was a madwoman and to leave her alone. Field Marshal Allenby wrote of Forbes after her 1,100-mile trek, "The intrepid Englishwoman leads us through experiences that would have appalled the hardiest old-time pioneers." Times were changing with the development of industry, the rise and fall of empires, and a growing social consciousness, all contributing to the beginning of a major paradigm shift around the world. There were loud cries for freedom, demands for nationalism and women's suffrage. Such actions filled the pages of international newspapers. News was shared across the world in government halls, cafes, desert tents, and the amazing souk whisper. Tired of subjugation, nationalists and their secret societies plotted rebellion, even going so far in Arabia as to infiltrate the Ottoman army with a secret society Ahad, plotting to overthrow it. Encouraged by the Russian victory over the Ottomans in 1877 and the liberty of the Balkan Vilayets, the three provinces, given in the Treaty of Berlin in 1878, the imperial power game continued as Russia marched on to Istanbul. By 1878, British relationships with the Ottoman Empire were sensitive. Britain was literally a thorn in the Ottoman side. Being actively invited to form land and maritime treaties with Arab rulers in the form of protectorates for protection of sovereignty of their lands against the Ottoman invasion. British travellers were to Ottomans potential dangers, especially when they went off the agreed track, as Gertrude Bell often did, and met with sheikhs. But the diplomatic imperial relationship was too important at that time, prior to the new friendship with the new German Empire, to ban travel. Ottoman soldiers and every available young man was now being deployed from every Arabian province to defend Istanbul. And it was for this very reason that Lady Anne Blunt and her husband Wilfred chose to visit Arabia at this time, to have the freedom to visit tribes and to buy the Arabian horse. Lady Anne books, The Tribes of the Euphrates and the Pilgramage to Nejd, give us an insight into the geopolitical history of the region through which they traveled, as relaying documentation and conversations that they gained with Arab scholars and the respected Arab and European travelers, which are credited in her book. Prior to the 17th century, tribal sheikhs were given semi-autonomy by the Turkish Ottoman Empire, which was unable to exert full control over them, often losing in battle. The wonderful book, Gulf Women, tells of the women who used to carry the water from well to well over 16 miles to feed so their tribes could drink. Why? Because their tribal leaders had poisoned the tribe wells that the Ottomans would have drunk from. These women were the heroines within the desert. They're unnamed, but they're known as the water carriers. At that time, smaller tribes paid tribute to the greater tribes and supported them in tribal war. In 1744, the devout Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab al-Tamimi formed a socio-religious alliance with the Sheikh of Diriyah in Nejd, of the House of Saud, and together they unified the entire region, creating a centralized government in Nejd. At that time, Nejd consisted of 3 districts, held to the north, Al-Qassim Central, and Riyadh in the south. Al-Qassim was the center of the Arabian Peninsula and famous for pilgrim routes to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. In 1869, Muhammad al-Kabir, Muhammad the Great of the House of Rashid, took much of the region, confining Ibn Saud to Riyadh. In 1891, Ibn Rashid would remove Ibn Saud for 7 years from Riyadh and to Kuwait, under Sheikh Mohammed al-Sabah, supported by the Ottoman government, who feared the uncontrollable growth of Ibn Rashid, would host the family. In those 7 years, Muhammad Kabir would die. Abdulaziz al-Saud, only 10 years old when he was exiled to Kuwait, would retake Riyadh with the support of the new ruler, Sheikh Mubarak the Great, and begin his expansion to create the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, working against Ottoman influence to defeat the House of Rashid. In the time of our presentation, Muhammad al-Rashid, Ibn Rashid, was accepted by the Ottomans as the Lord of Arabia, with his capital at Hale, in the mountains of Jabal Shammah. A ruthless man, violently removing all opponents, inclusive of family members, he nevertheless improved the region's prosperity. As an owner of a magnificent stable, each horse acquired through purchase from Nejdi horse breeders, Lady Anne wrote that each spring, Ibn Rashid sold 100 yearlings through Kuwait to the Indian army at £100 a head. £10,000, equivalent today of £1 million per annum. Nejd was the home of the Arabian horse, depicted in the UNESCO-protected petroglyphs on the mountains, carved in rocks over 6,000 years ago. The favorite steed of the Prophet, peace be upon him, the wild horse that had been tamed by Ishmael ibn Ibrahim over 5,000 years before. The Arabian horse was also the favorite horse of Emperor Napoleon and George Washington, and stated with their imperial expansions into Arabia, Alexander the Great and Genghis Khan. The Arabian horse is unique. Its endurance enables it to run over 200 miles without stopping. Although only 14.2 hands in height, it can carry a man of 15 stone into battle. It is kept cool by its thin black skin and its high tail, and it can stand extreme heat. It needs blankets in winter. Faithful and intelligent, it bonds with its master. And being kept in tents with children and bred for gentleness, it is the most gentle of creatures. I can vouch for the spirited characters, because giving this lecture tonight, I had to learn about the Arabian horse. And to further my research, I was kindly invited to view the Al-Rehman farm and the Al-Wad Arabians in Wafra in September. And I fell in love. They are the most beautiful of creatures. When I went into their stables, they knew I had arrived. And as I went over to one stable and talked to one, the others were discussing, obviously, what I was wearing, how I was talking to this. And they were very, very vocal about the fact I hadn't gone to talk to them. And I had to go around each one of them and discuss them. Of course, when I arrived to a few, they turned their backs on me and decided to have nothing to do with me. But it was wonderful to be invited to these studs, to the farms that have bred worldwide champions. At the end of this lecture, I will show you a picture of one of the worldwide champions that comes from Kuwait. Here's a baby. And as you notice, they are bred now for beauty, so their ears must stand upright. And I'm not quite sure about this, but Lady Anne stated that one or two horse breeders in her time used to put twine in between their ears to make them stand up. I'm not quite sure if that happens now. I'm sure it doesn't. And the tail, as soon as they were about a week old, the tail was put upright, and a stick was put so that the tail was large and stood upright. I was told in the farm that the tail is upright to protect the rider as the rider goes into battle. And it was absolutely wonderful to watch the horses that have their own characters, their own names, their own particular diets, and the way they are brushed, and the fact that they're so looked after by their grooms. I was offered one, and I do apologize, to bring tonight. So I did ask Mr. Walid if we could bring one, because the groom was going to come and the horse box, but he was a little bit worried because of the fact that in the Dar you have so many events, such as the wonderful Indian events, and he was a little worried that maybe more exotic animals would be asked to come, such as elephants and tigers. So we had to sort of draw a line and say no, but you would have seen one tonight. Next one, please, thank you. Thank you. This is Lady Anne Blunt, not in her Arabic traditional costume. She wore the male costume for protection, of course. And this is what she looked like. She was incredibly small and bird-like, although her husband said she was the bravest woman that he ever knew. And her pedigree is as interesting as her passion, but Mr. Badder's told you a lot about that. Her mother, Ada Countess Lovelace, she was the first computer programmer. And it was incredibly wonderful to find out that there was a lot written about her in Oxford University when they decided to mention this. She didn't live very long. She wrote for Charles Babbage what we now call algorithms in his creation of the analytical machine. Lady Anne was not only the granddaughter of Lord Byron, but she was also the granddaughter of Lady Annabella Noble. Now, she was a mathematician and known as the Princess of Parallelograms by Lord Byron. She was an educationalist, and she designed schools for people who could not afford to go to school, workers and children of who were really on the poverty line. Her great friend was Florence Nightingale, and her aunt, a subject of a future lecture, was the Archaeologist Lady Hester Stanhope, the first archaeologist to use modern excavating techniques in Ascalon in the first excavation of Palestine in 1815, with the permission of the Ottoman government, of course, assisted by the governor of Jaffa. She settled in Sidon, and she became bankrupt because she fed and housed hundreds of Druze and Muslim refugees, acquiring a great following, and became the nemesis of Ibrahim Pasha. She befriended the first Ibn Saud, and she was so feared by Ibrahim Pasha that he sought neutrality in his invasion of Syria. In 1869, Lady Anne, following her grandmother's footsteps, married the poet Wilfrid Blunt, 4 years her junior. A ruthless critic of his fellow countrymen abroad, after visiting Egypt and Syria in 1872, the couple desired to go into the Euphrates Valley, their travels depicted in her book, The Bedouin Tribes of Euphrates. In Damascus, they called on the infamous Lady Jane Digby, now 70 years old, fluent in 9 languages, an archaeologist and a solo traveler. She was now the wife of the Aniza Sheikh Mejdul Mizrab, 20 years her junior. Lady Jane, known as Digby al-Mejrab and Labin, wore traditional Arabic clothing and lived every year for 6 months in Damascus, in their home, set in a beautiful walled garden of flowers with a private room of exquisite English furniture, and 6 months in the desert. Lady Anne thought her very beautiful, dignified, and quiet. Here is her house. This very house would be the birthplace of Kuwait's Colonel Harold Dixon, husband of Dame Violet. In 1881, he was born and needed a wet nurse. The Sheikh found him one from the Aniza tribe, making him an Aniza milk brother and linking by tribal law to the House of Saud. And this, I found, must be the reason why he called his son Saud Dixon. On the 6th of December, Lady Anne and Wilfrid rode out through the Syrian gates onto the mountain path of Aleppo. She wrote in her journal of kingfishers perched on telegraph wires. They passed 500 soldiers per day trooping up to Istanbul. The deserters were in chains, and Lady Anne learned that 2/3 of the army had deserted by paying an equivalent of 4 shillings to their major before being allowed to escape. And then they'd been recaptured. They were given no pay and had little food. At night, the Blunts slept in cairns and mud hovels, the emptiest being full of 10 to 12 men. The hovel consisted of 4 walls, an oil lamp hung in the middle, and a thatch roof. There was a moving earth floor where a platform was available to escape crawling insects. A fire pit was dug out of the floor. Dressed in traditional male garments and speaking fluent Arabic, Lady Anne went unbothered. On the first day, they passed 1,000 camels carrying corn for the army and sporting the Turkish flag. Such a sight was followed by torrential rain, and they were lucky to cross the ford in time. The next calm was crowded with soldiers asking for news of the war and looking at their maps. To prevent an uproar, the Kanji begged them in French not to say anything to upset them about the fall of Kars and the other Ottoman defeats. Arriving in Aleppo, Lady Anne was struck by the beauty of the minarets, fortresses, and towers, but the severest of storms in Syria of 1877-8 kept them a month in Aleppo without possibility of movement. Most fortuitous, the British consul arrived with his wife and invited them to their home ruined by an earthquake 5 years before, once a convent with the luxury of running water and trees. The Turkish government, the Pasha of Dir, had installed Muhammad ibn Arak as their guide and the Ottoman informer. The Blunts and Muhammad struck a deal. They agreed to sponsor him to find a bride by donating a horse and a camel, while he in turn agreed to get them through areas which needed Ottoman permission. His task was easy. The Blunts was not. The two other branches of the Iraqs had not been found for 100 years. During their first journey, it was decided that the winter should be spent with the Anisa on the Euphrates, learning from the experts about the horse. No European had ever been allowed to accompany the Anisa migration. It involved a 10 to 12-hour trek. On their way, they had to be protected from hungry wolves. The Euphrates Valley is deeply cut with chalky cliffs. It's 5 miles wide, and a meadow exists as green as emeralds, surrounded by the ruins of towers of a former majesty. In the valley, the Babylonian lion roamed, occasionally a man-eater. The Ottoman government offered £3 for every skin. 3 had recently been shot from an English steamer going from Baghdad to Basra on the Tigris. In addition, jackals frequented the tent to look for food, and Lady Anne would grab their hind legs and pull them out and throw them into the desert. On December the 6th, 1878, after a respite in Britain, they finally travelled to Nejd. This is their route. So all the dotted lines here is the route that they took. It covered 190 miles in freezing weather from Kaf to Al-Jof in 8 days on horseback. Al-Jof was a small walled town full of date palm gardens. Mohammed's family lived in outlying settlements where they found a 15-year-old bride for him to marry and return to claim in 2 years. An invitation to the governor's fortress at Qasir Rashid was forthcoming. After presenting him with a black cloak with gold trim, cloaks were very valid in those days, they were given a guide across the Nafud's desert to hail. Their guide, Radi, a shriveled old man, told them tales of travelers perishing in the desert, and in nearly every hollow they saw telltale bones of those people that had not made it. Zigzagging to escape the deep hollows, Radi told more and more hell-raising stories of murder and deception. Lady Anne writes, "We have been all day in the Nafud, and it is unlike Mr. Palgrave's nightmare of impossible horror. It is true that he passed in the summer, and we're now in midwinter. The thing that strikes you most when you first look at it is the color. Red and crimson, not white or yellow like the sand in Egypt, but bright red. It is a mistake to believe it's barren. It is better wooded and richer in pasture than any desert that we have seen since leaving Damascus." As wells became sparse, she writes on the 19th of December, "It was a terrible day for camels and man, weaker, and now they are incapable of carrying the load." Finally, they arrived in Jubba, a paleo lake, with evidence of Paleolithic evidence, 5,500 to 11,000 years old. This journey is covered in the Al-Arabiyyah TV program, Retracing Arab Footsteps, Lady Anne Blunt's home in Saudi Arabia. Sheikh Saud al-Nayef created the museum in which her guest house, offered to Lady Anne by his grandfather, stands around the sweet water well, Al-Jub, which was discovered 1,000 years earlier by his family's she-camel. A plaque to Lady Anne is on the museum wall. Of Jubba, she said, "It is one of the most beautiful and strangest places in the world." This is the place where Lady Anne stayed. Nearby, Jebel Salman bathes some of the most incredible Arabian petroglyphs, of which Lady Anne remarks. The rocks towering above are very grand, being of purple sandstone streaked and veined with yellow, and having an upper facing of black. They are from 700 to 800 feet high, and their bases are scored with old watermarks. The 39-kilometer area is now a UNESCO-protected open museum, 100 kilometers from Hale. Older petroglyphs of ostrich, horse, chariots, domestic dogs, and warriors are darker than the brighter later creations. Approaching Hale, she wrote, "The sight was beautiful, beyond description. Rocks and tells cropped up like islands. Violet-colored mountains changed to sapphire in the sun. The air was so clear." Lady Anne refused to disguise as she went into Hale and chose to quote the Queen of Sheba's words, "We are persons of distinction in search of other persons of distinction." On her arrival in Hale, what she saw was a stunning and sophisticated palace with great wealth and etiquette. Muhammad Kabir was splendid in gold, denying the austerity of Wahhabism, and reminded Anne of King Richard III in appearance. Cheetahs, gazelles, antelope all roamed the gardens, and the Blunts were welcomed into the entertainment hall where Palgrave, Doughty, and Germain had been received. They attended banquets and inspected 800 soldiers immaculately dressed on parade. Lady Anne was invited to visit the harem, where every woman wore gold and turquoise. The women were horrified by Lady Anne's suggestion that they might exercise the horses. Ibn Rashid's stables held horses that were hobbled and ungroomed due to the winter cold and fed on dry barley. They had to wait to spring to eat green corn. But every summer, Ibn Rashid took his livestock to the desert tribes to be cared for. Lady Anne was informed to make a colt run faster, give it 1 month's mother's milk. An additional 5 months, add goat's milk. For the next 6 months, give only camel milk and wheat in a nose bag. At the age of 1 year, no milk, dry wheat and green grass. At 2 years, the horse must exist on gruel in the summer and taken everywhere with his master. At 3 years, and only at 3 years, he may gallop. And then the same was given. Then, if he be of true blood, he will not be left behind. Yalla! The tide turned suddenly. Muhammad in Iraq, in grandiose, lied about his position, that the Blunts were under his protection, and the horses and servants were his. Muhammad al-Kabir turned against the Blunts, and tension and mistrust reigned in the palace. They escaped as quickly as possible on their horses and left with the Persian pilgrim caravan, which was 5 miles long. This allowed the Blunts time to visit Ibn Arak's relatives, the tribe of Sheikh Mutaruk al-Arak, who, having heard of his relatives' visit to Ibn Rashid, appeared to claim brotherhood after 100 years. Marching behind the green and red Haji banner, and Ibn Rashid's soldier police on dromedaries supporting his standard of protection, with Ali, the Emir al-Hajj, a trusted slave of Ibn Rashid at its head, the caravan was a sight to behold. The sudden whiteness of ground, depicting the presence of water, caused a great rush towards it, and the Blunts quickly filled their goatskins prior to the arrival of the pilgrims, who, as a ritual, first washed in it and then drank it. The road was called Darb Zubaydah, the road of the pilgrims, after the queen of Caliph Harun al-Rashid, who, almost dying of thirst on the Hajj, built rest stops, wells, and reservoirs for pilgrims. The traditions of the Desert Surprise Lady Anne, as meat had to be bagged by each traveller for their own meals, a boar hunt resulted in her husband's horse being severely wounded. With no sand to pack the wound, dried dung was used to great effect. And then a local man was found who cleaned and packed the wound with alum, curing the horse totally. On arrival in Bersha, the horses were sent to the Crabbit farm in England. A second stud was opened at Sheikh Obeid in Cairo, where purchases from Ali Pasha's stud was made on his death. Contrary to belief, horses were, at the time of the Blunt's arrival, only owned by the great sheikhs because of their expense, and camels were used in battle. This was to be changed in the Arab Revolt, which favored battle horses, so the horse started to subtly change to go into battle. Lady Anne retired to Sheikh Obeid in her later years on separation from Wilfrid Blunt, famous for his serial philandering, and continued riding with her desert friends without a saddle well into her 70s. In her continual political activism, she fought for Irish unity and hosted members of the Arab Bureau in World War I, who were the nemesis of the British Indian Army men, and shared her tribal information in the creation of the Arab Revolt for nationalism against the Ottoman Empire. Gertrude Bell was a regular visitor. Lady Anne died in Cairo in 1917 and is buried in the nuns' graveyard. The Crabbit stud passed to her daughter Judith, the 16th Lady Wentworth, who fought her father for ownership, physically removing from their stables the mistreated famous stud horses with the assistance of her son. She won, and the stud continued until 1972. Today, the pure Crabbit lineage is famous throughout the world. Ladies and gentlemen, I will complete my talk with the most beautiful photograph of Kuwait and UK champion, and indeed is winning more and more championships, of Rafat Al-Rayat of the Rimat Arab stud. Thank you very much for listening.